But we stopped asking that question because we were so locked into the theory that was the sort of founding basis of the movement, that if you just pushed the US government, then that would be enough to change conditions on the ground in Darfur. And this again was the power largely of the anecdotes that had been told around Rwanda. Anecdotes that I bet most of the people in this room have heard. The Senator Paul Simon story. Senator Paul Simon, who said if at the start of the Rwandan crisis every senator had received 100 letters from their constituents, then the situation would have turned out differently. It's an anecdote, and yet it became really the core foundation of the movement, and we clung very tightly to this theory that it was in the realm of domestic US politics that the battle to save lives was won or lost. That may very well have been true in Rwanda in 1994, and the tragedy is that we'll actually never know for sure because nobody then even bothered to try. On Darfur we did try, and what we found is that it was actually not true. The world had changed. Those lessons that were written after Rwanda were written at a very specific moment in US and world history. The end of the Cold War and before the invasion of Iraq. It was when US hard and soft power was absolutely at its peak. And we also had at that point really seen the rise of these other important players in the global system. What we now call the BRIC countries, the BRIC bloc, the emerging economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China. The rise of the regional bodies like the African Union and the Arab League. We hadn't factored in how these different parts of the system could have a huge impact on what could or could not happen in Darfur. There are some cases where it didn't matter too much. The funding, it got to people on the ground in Darfur, and don't let anyone ever tell you that activists didn't save lives. They saved lives through that humanitarian funding because by that time, most of the people were in camps, dependent on that aid to survive. But there were other respects in which having the theory of change wrong really did make a difference. And I think what the movement needed were its leaders to take a really hard and honest look at US leverage at that point in time. There was a small window, perhaps at the very beginning of the atrocities in Darfur, a point that we all missed. After 9/11, before the invasion of Iraq, when Khartoum was genuinely really scared that the US might do something in terms of the hard use of force. And that was pretty key, in fact, as to why they were signing the North-South Peace Agreement and getting traction on that at the time. But once the invasion of Iraq happened and it really became a quagmire, the ability of the US to credibly threaten the use of force as a stick, it had pretty much disappeared. And so what did you have left? Did you have economic leverage? Did you have diplomatic leverage? You didn't have that either, because back in the 1990s, Osama bin Laden in Sudan, we had designated Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism, and really put the full weight of US economic and diplomatic sanctions on Khartoum. There just wasn't that much further to go. So you didn't have much more in terms of economic leverage, didn't have much more in terms of diplomatic leverage, and no longer had a credible stick in terms of the use of force. The only thing really that you had in terms of leverage were carrots. The suggestion that you would in fact normalize relations with Khartoum, and that was something that no activist wanted to see, normalizing relations with a genocidal government. The real leverage was with China. And I think some of the people involved in divestment were pretty early at picking this up and seeing this, because they were seeing the economic connections. China, the biggest investor in the Sudanese oil industry, China that also had a veto on the UN Security Council and was very happy to use it. It would say to other people when they were trying to draft strong resolutions, if you actually table that, if you present it, then we will use our veto. And instead of calling China on its bluff, people backed away from drafting the strong resolutions. in what is in many ways quite a depressing book, the one shining chapter is when activists really recognized the power of China in the situation and went directly after the Chinese government. And in doing so, they threw out all the conventional wisdom that you hear about Chinese foreign policy. You go and speak to any expert on Chinese foreign policy, and they'll tell you that Beijing cannot be moved through public shaming. The only way to do it is quietly, gently, behind the scenes, slowly over time. They threw that all out the window and launched the Genocide Olympics campaign. It wasn't nuanced, it was as in your face as anything, but they had their theory of change right. Not only was Beijing the right target for a campaign in terms of its leverage over China, but they realized that they weren't going to get anywhere by just trying to convince Beijing that human rights in Darfur mattered. They had to find something that Beijing cared about, and that was its own image in the build-up to the 2008 Summer Olympics, and that by shaming that, they could get a shift in China's policy towards Darfur. 2 days after the campaign was launched, Beijing appointed a special envoy on Darfur. First time they'd done it. Now, appointing a special envoy I don't think necessarily means any change in policy, but it shows that you've got their attention. What's interesting then is over the course of a year, you had a 180-degree flip in Chinese foreign policy and its approach towards peacekeepers, from refusing to support them at the UN Security Council to voting for them, that then eventually allowed the peacekeepers to deploy. So I think within that we have a moment of an incredibly successful model. China, that it's difficult to even get its own citizens to listen to it, will listen to Western-based activists if you get the target right. Overall, one of the lessons from Fighting for Darfur then is that the battle to protect civilians takes place in this realm of global geopolitics. Yes, it's still important to win the fights domestically. Yes, it's important that you win the battle in Washington, but that's not enough. It may not always be the most important thing, often it in fact won't be. And it's certainly very rarely going to be sufficient. And so the question for you guys is how to look firstly at the other democracies that are really important out there. And I'm not just talking UK and France, I am talking Brazil, India, South Africa,